All right, so welcome to the review of the new basic qualification exam questions. We'll be doing this uh, every week, and today we're going to start looking at regulations section 1.1 to 1.5. So the new exam will be effective July the 15th. 2025, and we'll try to do 10 or 15 minutes each week and break it up into small chunks. And the new thing with it is that there is a study guide and a similar document, the exam aid, which you're allowed to bring into the exam. And if when you can use the study guide, we'll bring it up and show it to you. Now, the format, the way it's presented is the left half of the screen is the actual exam question from the PDF document, and the right is a summary of the key material, and any new material will be, any new questions will be in bold. We won't spend a lot of time reading the exam question, but if there's something new about the exam question or something different, we'll look at it in more detail. So there's 8 sections covered in the exam. So we're on section 1, which is rules and regulations. And when we look at rules and regulations, it's broken up into 25 subsections. And today we're doing 1 to 5. So we'll look at the Act regulations and the department, address, fees, and posting, power of inspectors, amateur radio operators, and operations and qualifications. So these are the questions over here from the document. And so the regulations and the Act, it's sort of a 3-part series. You got the Act, you got the regulations, and then you have the guidance document or the standards below. So the Radio Communications Act is the high level. It gives the authority to make your regulations. It assigns the authority to publish regulations or standards. And it also provides information on offenses and penalties, which is covered in another section. So the department that's responsible for the enforcement of this regulation is ISED Canada, Innovation, Science, and Economic Development Canada. And then when you get down into next level, you have the regulations, and the regulations defines what amateur radio service is. And that's basically it for that section. The next section has to do with addresses, fees, and posting. So you're required when you have an address change, you have 30 days to notify ISED of the address change. Now, when you look at the amateur radio certificate, it's valid for life. And they're just saying again, another question here. You have 30 days to notify if for an address change. Here, the amateur radio certificate must be retained at the station. And if a radio inspector asks you to produce a copy of the certificate, you have 48 hours to produce the certificate. The next thing is, what is the fee for it? So it's free for the initial first one. And then also you need to keep the radio operator certificate at the address that is on file with ISED. You're not required legally to have it on your person, although it does make sense if you're away from your address location to have a copy in your wallet, but there's no requirement for that. This is a new question. So it asks you, what is the fee to issue a replacement call sign with a new prefix due to a change in address to a new province or territory. So you're moving to a different area of the country, so you have to change the prefix of your call sign. So that is free. And over here, so the initial one is free, and if you move, it's free. The other new question that has come up is if you're going to change your call sign to another call sign, or you want to change it to a two-letter call sign, how much is it going to cost you? And the answer here is $60. So that's it for the for that section. Now we're getting into the powers of the inspectors and penalties. So one of the things here that if you're an amateur radio operator, you're not allowed to transmit outside of the amateur radio bands. So this is prohibited, and you're also subject to penalties, which will be assessed for the control operator. And then here, if you falsely transmit, for example, Mayday, that's a false or fraudulent message, and that isn't allowed unless it is an actual real emergency. The next one is if you transmit a false message or a distress signal, what's the penalty? So it could be a fine of less than $5,000 or a prison term of less than 1 year or both. And these penalties are defined in the Radio Communication Act. So this is one of these questions. There's a few of them in the exam. They've eliminated most of these questions, but there's still maybe 5 or 6 of them throughout the exam. So this one asks you, which of the following statements is not correct? The Minister of Innovation, Science and Industry may suspend an amateur radio operator certificate. So where the certificate was obtained through misrepresentation, so that is true. Where the holder has failed to comply with a request to pay fines or interest due, so that is also true. And then you go down here where the holder has contravened the Radio Communication Act, its regulations, or in terms of the condition of the certificate. That's also true. So this is not true, with no notice or opportunity to make a representation. So if you are fined or charged with something, you have an opportunity, a notice will be given to you, and you'll have an opportunity to make a representation and hear your side of the story. So C is not true. So here's another question, and it has to do with which one of the following statements is not correct. So where entry is refused and is necessary to perform their duties under the Radio Communication Act, a radio inspector may obtain a warrant. That is true. In executing a warrant, a radio inspector shall not use force unless accompanied by a peace officer and force is authorized. That is also true. The person responsible for a dwelling entered by a radio inspector shall provide the inspector with the requested information. That is also true. So then down here, radio inspector may enter a dwelling without the consent of the occupant and without a warrant. That's not true. What usually happens is if they want to enter your dwelling, they do an inspection. They usually go to a court and get a warrant. So then the inspector knocks on the door and says, I want to inspect your dwelling. And you say, no, you're not allowed in. So then the inspector says, okay, I've got a warrant here to allow entry. And they usually bring the police along with them. And if you refuse or if you don't let them in, then the police will come and arrest you. or move you out of the way so that the inspector can do the inspection. Here's a new question. When is an amateur radio operator permitted to transmit false information? And the answer is A, transmitting false information is never permitted. And there's another new question. Interfering with or obstructing any radio communication without lawful cause is prohibited. The person found guilty is liable to what penalty? So this relates back to a previous question, and the answer is D, a fine not exceeding $5,000 or a prison term not exceeding 1 year or both. So section 4 has to do with amateur radio operators. So, they ask questions, who can be an amateur radio operator? So there's no age limit, and you must pass the basic qualification exam to become an amateur radio, hold an amateur radio certificate. The next question is, which one of these certificates issued is maybe issued an amateur radio certificate? So if you look here, the only one here is the Canadian Radio Communication Operator General Certificate Maritime. And if you have that certificate, then you can get an amateur radio operator certificate. And then the next question is, what order can you obtain your additional certificates? So you can do it and you can get it in any order. So that would be advanced or Morse code after you get the basic, or you can do the basic with honors, but you can do them in any order after you get your basic qualification. So then there's another question here. What is the words per minute that you need for the Morse code qualification? And that is 5 words per minute. And then the other one is, if you hold an amateur radio certificate with advanced qualification beside the amateur radio service, in what other service does the observation allow you to operate a station? And the answer here is no other service. So if you have an amateur radio certificate, you cannot operate in, for example, aeronautic service, maritime service, or land mobile service. These all have additional requirements. So here is another one. What conditions must the candidate meet? So the only requirement is to have a valid address in Canada. So now we get into operations and qualifications. So under what circumstances can an amateur radio operator with an advanced qualification install, place in operation, modify, or repair radio apparatus on behalf of another person? So you hold an advanced qualification, so you can only do that if the other person also holds an authorization. Here's a new question, which is similar to the previous one. Under what circumstances can an amateur radio operator reprogram a land mobile transmitter on behalf of another person to use on 2 meters? So, they've added in this question basically, and they've added in reprogram. And the answer is D, only if the other operator also holds an amateur radio operator certificate. Here is another question. So what is the regulatory requirement to install an amateur radio transmitter on behalf of another person? So here is both of you and the other person must hold amateur radio operator certificates. And here's another question. An amateur radio operator with basic and Morse code qualifications may install an amateur radio station for another person. And again, only if both of you have the or the other person has the appropriate amateur radio operator certificate. And here's a new question. So they've added in some additional requirements here for repair and place in service. So when the regulatory, what if the regulatory requirement must be met to allow you to repair an amateur radio operator transmitter on behalf of another person? And the answer down here is D. Both you and the other person must hold amateur radio operator certificates. And then another question here, what is the regulatory requirement must be met to allow you to place an amateur radio transmitter in service on behalf of another person? And again, it's the same, both you and the other person must hold the amateur radio operator certificate. So the whole sense of this whole section is that both of you need to have amateur radio operator certificates. And that's it for those questions. So let me stop the recording and we'll continue on next week with 1-6 to 110.